Before I begin, I should say that the work on inequality and its spillover, I would say, to engage with intersectionality from not going into deep of theory or methods is that it bases on the reason that why after all we examine inequality. In a very rough sense, there are two broad bases of it. One is to know that inequality is unjust, what is the extent of inequality which is bad, that is called judgmental, that we say inequality how much. But also the other pocket which is very important is the source of inequality, from where does the inequality come from, and that is actually in other way characterization of inequality. And when it comes to characterization, it becomes difficult because we can't characterize inequality with a single most attribute. There are umpteen number of statistical methods to, first it starts with very simplest decomposition, and then we talk about where it comes from. We want to pinpoint the source of inequality, and that actually brings this component of intersectionality. When we can't pinpoint a particular characteristics, that means characteristics is an identity, and I also feel that there is no unit that we can say has a singular identity. We all have multiple set of identities, and therefore, even if it is you go down to unit level, where do you find out that characteristics which is pinpointedly that this is what is the characteristics, not merely for identification, but in the process also we can explain that why that particular identity or characteristics gives rise to inequality. So, outline of my presentation today, I have just made a kind of a wild structure to my talk. It is basically not covering systematically on theory or methods, but just to make it very teaching class orientation. So, I thought that what I would emphasize on 4 broad themes surrounding this topic of inequality. One is that is the data that we are analyzing, all data that is at hand we are analyzing for the purpose of inequality or intersectionality. What is that data? That data, is it suitable, it is adequate, it is informed about intersectionality research, because every research what we do, the input should be informed by the intention. If our intention is to study intersectionality, then the data collection has to be informed by that. Then I would also engage with some bit of study of intersectional inequalities using indices from simple to little complex ones. Then I would talk about the common methods that is people engage with is the perception association with descriptives, regression, decompositions. You know very well that when you do very simple descriptives, people say you have not used advanced methods. When you use advanced methods, people say that you have not taken care of the descriptives. It is a conflict which happens very frequently with, I know when I get a paper with a very advanced method and I have to write a comment, first I will take a position that the advanced method is fine, but let me go to whether the person has given me enough descriptives or not. So, this becomes the conflict with rank up or the process of methods. Finally, I will also talk about some theoretical insights into the econometric analysis that we do, and actually there are theoretical interpretations which are required, they are not straitjacketed as we claim or often the papers claim. Now, point 1, now we will engage with this, that whether the data collection, the survey allows quantitative research on intersectionality. This is the question first of all I want to engage with. We are doing, of course, none of the surveys are conducted for us, this information are not obtained with the intention that we should do intersectionality analysis. So, what is in this section, what is the level at which you do quantitative analysis is that you first see tests of association. I say any outcome you look at characteristics association. I am not going to advanced inequality here. And then also fundamentally what happens when I find something associated, there is an immediate promptness within me to associate, no, that has to be the reason. it's an automatic one. Of course, statistician doesn't do that, but we also try to go that path to finally say that this is because of this, that's because we found the association. And the second thing is generalizing, because we always deal with a sample set of information. We find something, should I make a statement which is general and it should be acceptable? So why generalizing? Because it is not merely the magnitude and pattern, but also to channelize that kind of a work into a policy level, saying this is happening and how to remedy it, put it onto the operational front of resource allocation, designing programs and everything else. We should have an input to that. So usually as a statistician, that's why I wrote the generalization is purely we have based on statistical significance, which everybody knows fundamentals of it, but basic element that lends statistical strength is you must understand n of values, n of observations. That is very seriously important, because I can do significance, but ultimately it matters what is the n. And why I am bringing in n? Because it's a very crucial element in this whole intersectionality engagement. The principle of generalization by design overlooks cases which are particular or specific. Now I am going to give you an example where sometimes back when this human development analysis was going on, the first human development report came at a national level. And in few years it went to state level. Then you must have had there at panchayat level human development report. Somebody made a joke to me, when will you start doing village level? Then I just joked back saying, why not at household level? So actually it is not about that the concept how far disaggregate you can go, but also there is a limitation that what does it say. Same way, if you want to do decomposition to a level by taking characteristics and attributes, you can go to the unit ultimately, which I started with saying that all of us do not have a unique identity. We have also 3-4 attributes. Of course, if I wear my philosophical hat, then I will say about identity prioritization and all, which is a different area which I work on. And then that means it will not work with the absence of data, which I have written is not absence of data meant for intersectionality analysis. It will not work. Now, when we say that intersectionality analysis which we are doing, I am not denying that we are doing which is limited or something, but it is actually the existing data gives us very little scope to do a proper intersectionality analysis. Why? Because the most of the data sets, the large scale data sets like National Family Health Survey, DHS, all you take, they have an intended purpose of estimation of certain parameters, seeing differentials and all this. They have not obtained the data. Any data that I analyze, I am an analyst, I say that is not obtained for me, but I have to make the most of it, and that's what we are doing. But it is more important that in the collection exercise, this sensitization is necessary. That means you have to somewhere say that intersectionality analysis we will do with NFHS data. That means the broad characteristics that you want to include, even if you have already done theorization and so on, these are the characteristics, at least that should get into your stratification exercise in sampling. Otherwise, there is a problem. You cannot just say that I will not have, because same thing is true, because if you look at education, residential stratification is not got into NFHS data, then your all analysis by education and residence will not actually give you results. So we feel that sufficient sample, that sufficient maybe the way I am talking can go to a very what is called a level that we cannot afford. Money is required for sample, and it reminds me of a talk I gave somewhere on design effect, and I was asked by somebody that, Professor Mishra, fine, design effect will not be satisfied because everything cannot have random sampling. So you take something else and the design effect exceeds 2, you say it is bad. So do you mean to say that we will have all kind of stratification in the sampling? It's not possible. But this warrants that if we fix certain attributes, we can have a sampling which will allow the intersectionality analysis. But only unfortunate thing is that for every outcome, the intersectionality process is much different. It is not that we are examining just identities and attribute, anything which comes our way, but certain outcomes we are interested in certain identities and characteristics, not all the time the same. So fixing that becomes difficult. Now question, what can be done? We have nationwide surveys, they are uniformly designed. The greater focus is about representativeness, the greater focus is about getting estimates which are having lesser of confidence interval, more reliable, more credible estimates. So one lesson we learn is that we have to have a design which will allow us for intersectionality analysis. This is the first message that I wanted to engage with, and you know that, for example, if any one of you want, I would say in a statistical language, intersectionality analysis is a Cartesian product of 10 attributes. So if I do Cartesian product, I will have a whole range and everything is unique. So that reduces my n, and how much will be that we should be prepared to decide prior to conducting the survey. Now I come to the second point. First point, I hope, just to give you a summary, is that this engagement with intersectionality needs a pre-designed, adequately scientifically designed sample which should allow us. That was the message that I wanted to give. Now another thing which is very much, much of the inequality literature is on this, is that we of course inequality engaging people from Gini to concentration index. I do not think that they engage all of them with this, but actually the advanced literature on inequality analysis calls for this, that because this gives a qualitative assessment of any measure that you have got, how good it is to have these properties satisfied. One thing which you do is that just magnitude change of trends and patterns of inequality, but the inequality measure satisfies certain properties or not is important, and that is important from the premise that I started with, that if an inequality measure you are going to decompose or you are going to give a treatment to it in terms of which is the source of inequality, then it should have the basic sound properties which comes from axiomatic literature. Just I will not take you into the mathematics of it, but just I wanted to familiarize you with the virtues of these methods. Now this is okay, like if you say that why there are inequality examination when we do, and why the motivation comes from Professor Sen, that he is also one of the champions of the axiomatic literature by himself, and we say it is crucially intended towards that. If giving you a small example which may not be conveying from the slide. Now if I have an inequality measured for an aggregate, if there is a two groups and I am making a temporal comparison, that means if overall inequality decreased, then it should actually show that it has decreased in both groups or not. Otherwise, the overall inequality decreased, if I comment that inequality has decreased, is perhaps partially true, because one group inequality might have increased. So the reason is that you must have to satisfy some of these properties, which is therefore it is technically essential rather than taking a simplest measure. Now what is that? It is not important to get an inequality measure, but also to say, now I come to the point that inequality of what is your outcome, but also you are interested in inequality y, and there is your group attributes y, which group is. After all, inequality is a distributional construct. I will come to vertical and horizontal inequalities in a minute time, where you know that where actually which section for what reason it is happening. So it is very, very important that distribution is a statistical construct, I understand, but when we engage with the notion of inequality from a vertical perspective or horizontal with the broad categories, I would rather make it more explicit that vertical inequalities are count based and horizontal inequalities are representation based. Here of course I say, because horizontal inequalities are group inequalities we say, but why I use the word representation based is because ultimately we are, like in this set of measures that I have here in front of you today, does not include a most commonest and simplest measure, which is called relative deprivation. Suppose if you have 3-4 groups and you use a principle called representational principle, then the best thing to say, whether you measure or not, the notionally, in count and in case you don't match. That means that is the ideal. If count and the case means case is death, case is disease, and count is your strength. So your strength share and your case share, if they match, we say that is ideal. Any departure from that is basically inequality, according to the RDI, according to the relative deprivation index. But of course, we have distributional measures, which actually it's a statistical construct and can have various facets and dimensions. One dimension I just gave you, what is RDI. We can have principle on sequence inequality polarization that will give rise to different measures. Now I come to the details of and which one, why I engage in this question on vertical horizontal is which one of this will facilitate intersectionality better or not. That is my concern, why I bring this in. And you know that when you want to, it is always every policy says we have to be, that equity, inequality has to come down. But of course, therefore it involves, if you want to bring down the overall inequality, where do you focus? There can be a particular group which is getting, according to this again fashionable terminologies of exclusion. So they are getting excluded, and you feel that you have to do that, or you have to engage with a certain particular identity group, that inequality will improve. So in fact, if you go with the inequality examination's traditional purpose, and now as we have come so far on working on inequality, now what we broadly should engage is not the quantum of inequality, but actually the feature of inequality. That is more important. The quantum of inequality, why I am saying at this point, is not very important, because a statistician uses quantum of inequality as an adjustment parameter primarily. It is just an adjustment parameter, does not describe anything else. So we have vertical inequality, and then I say in these two kinds of inequality, how do you bring intersectionality? In vertical inequality, as you know, there is no identity involved. It's simply count based. Vertical count based inequality will be still, for intersectionality is important, because here I don't give an attribute, but I can give a distributions share, like what people do about percentile, decile. You want to look at those as identities. So there, when you do, the logic that gives some link to an understanding of intersectionality is basically within group and between group. That means this justifies that a particular group is having an inherent inequality more, rather than those group actually deriving between group inequality share is more. But the most suitable, and which has actually given rise to the concept of intersectionality, is horizontal, not vertical. Vertical cannot tell you any definitional attribute, and what is the fashionable area of interest to know the attribute, because we want to say rural SC men. So we want to have those attributes in place. Then only we can say like these characteristics in place, and which is facilitated by the horizontal inequality concept. Here itself I want to give a very simpler idea of horizontal inequality can also have principles. One principle which I told about representational, it can have a sequence principle, it can have a polarization principle on horizontal. But the basic principle that it is guided by is first starts with representation, because that convinces very easily that if you are in count and case don't match, or it is reversed, then that is definitely not desirable. Now when we talk about it has an intrinsic value upon fairness, it has an instrumental value. Why I differentiate this is because intrinsic value is understandable, but it has an instrumental value because of that particular characteristics or attribute. If we can explain that the disadvantage is incurring, that is very important to highlight. Now we know this is three things. Representative, I told already. We have subjective ideals. Usually in measurement of inequality or in conversion procedure of a particular distribution, this ideal fixation we often ignore, because ideal, everything that is in a class when I teach Gini measure, I ask, what is the ideal? People do not know the ideal, but they know that 0.5 Gini is worse than 0.3 Gini. But essentially, ideal is very important to know, because you are, after all, evaluating a departure from ideal. And that ideal can be representative, can be subjective. Why I say subjective is because we sometimes have to prioritize and emphasize on a subjective identity group. That can be our own choice. And then, of course, minimax and Rawlsian principle, if you go, that is just a theoretical thing. It cannot be actually implemented, as Arrow puts it, as bottomless pit. So, it's like you cannot go down to that level. Of course, it exists, because it's important to know that is the extreme situation we can go. Now, in vertical and horizontal inequalities, the methods that has been actually adopted is that you have an interpersonal comparison, you have a individual mean difference variance based approach in vertical inequality, and then you have in horizontal inequality intergroup comparison. You can compute not necessarily the one which I told is representative, you can compute within group specific Ginis, and also there is a group analog of Gini. This is on which I myself with my co-authors, we have published a paper on group analog of Gini. And just to give you a very simpler elaboration, not going into the equation of it, is that often in inequality computation, we ignore the overall level of the phenomenon. Suppose you are talking of undernourishment, you are talking of child mortality, there is a level. So, if you are doing it by group, if you sort them from countable number from low to high, what will happen? The overall prevalence average is actually accumulation. You add groups. What you expect is that from origin, if you start and draw a line, so every possible cumulated mean should lie on that line, but it doesn't, like your Gini. And this is called the group profile. Group profiling is particularly a cumulative incidence computation. If you do a cumulative way, sorting them from countable from lowest number to highest. And on this, the work that I did, which appeared in Oxford Development Studies, is basically to give a group analog of Gini, which is facilitating somewhat in our intersectionality attempt of looking at inequality. The other is the group mean difference, because of the fact that you don't go into the group profiling, and this actually is borrowed from what is very popularly known in literature as Sorok's poverty profile, profiling poverty. These are the properties. I am not going into details of them, but these properties gives us certain clue as to when we have an inequality measure, should they satisfy this. Just to impress you, I can give you one or two of that which will actually remind you that these properties are essential. Is because one is, suppose for instance, I talk about monotonicity. If monotonicity in a simpler way, that is a very technical word, and when we do with monotonicity in a simpler way is that inequality which you measure has increased. It should be complied with the fact that it has increased for every group. Whatever definition, it has increased for every group. So, the statement that you make summarily as inequality has increased will hold true, provided it is for everybody. If there is a group which is actually inequality is declining, another group inequality has increased. That is what monotonicity, it is not conformed. So, there are problems like transfer sensitivity. Why it is required? Because of the fact that is this inequality distribution across groups convey us that some groups inequality is reducing at the cost of other groups increasing. Could be because of our own intervention, actions or whatever. So, in that point I say that these properties are important in an inequality measure. Now, I come to the fact beyond conventional approach of decomposing inequality, understanding inequality in its characteristics aspect, we go to intersectionality. And I say intersectionality will also become a kind of a thing which I showed Rawlsian. You can go down to the unit, you can go down to the individual ultimately. Now, why? Because when we take this thing which I have written, there can be people with plus, 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 minus, plus, when I say, when you are trying for every unit a particular attribute you want to just categorize in good, bad, let us say. It can be good, 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 bad. There can be combinations of different things, which actually is called in technical language dimensional matching, because actually across multiple dimensions when we want to look at an individual identity, it actually does not conform all the time. Like giving an example, education does good for something, but you can still find cases education does not do good. There can be, but the proportion might be smaller. That means if you found out that educated people do not smoke, does not mean that you will not find a very highly educated guy not smoking. That could be situation that you will have a minus. So that is the reason that one of the reason that we want these outliers or the relatively less relevant cases to be foregone, like you remove them. That should be our case to examine. And you have to be, this is because each of these categories could also be because of what focus has been put, because if you go today, immunization focus is there, how immunization is improving is not that other parameters are equally improving, it may not be, because it may be due to focus, it may be due to the attribute of the individual, and it may be due to a mutual mismatch of that one advantage is your advantage is somebody's disadvantage, I say that. And then what about more more complicated within group aspects? What happens is that rural areas or urban areas are deprived. To say that is easy, because it is one characteristic that you are saying. But when you say this thing, it is to say that rural area is disadvantaged. But take India, you have rural area disadvantage not of the same magnitude, it is different. Now as a statistician I say that an outcomes level is important in terms of describing the extent of disadvantage. That is my thesis, but not my thesis is that in an outcome, if the level is improving, obviously the extent of disadvantages will be conditioned by that. That is one. But actually it is not common that you can have a disadvantage, but that has its own distribution, and that distribution emerges from what is your level. So it is not very easy to compute even the simplest, forget about intersectionality, the difference that we talk of in a single attribute also is conditioned by the level of the phenomena, the change in the level of the phenomena. So when I say why intersectionality, and I appreciate intersectionality from this perspective, that I say there are contradictions of attributes which actually says it does not conform to a certain pattern. That hints first that it is not which attribute is operating, that which I will come at the end to paper by Aditi, where you talk about how do you, what is called, the word which you use is mediate. I am exactly not getting the word, that middle groups and the process which, yes, leveraging. So I will come to leveraging later, because what happens to leveraging because of a certain attributes which is dominant, which is not. In fact, are we certain our answers are clear? Can a rural man have better education than urban woman all the time? Then we know that it is certain. If we say some tribal caste groups have better education than other groups, even better than non-SC/ST. Here I wanted, when I teach in the class variance, I give an example like this. You have an output like literacy given by characteristics, rural, urban, male, female, caste, working, non, whatever. So if you have a binary attribute, you have certain differences, and you find among those differences one attribute shows a very high difference and other attributes show minimum difference. But if I, as a statistician who is engaged more to increase variance, otherwise my job is zero, if there is no variance I have no work. So to increase variance, what I do, I take a Cartesian product of that. Obviously the rates, if you take even three attributes, rural, urban, male, female and SC/ST, for yourself do an exercise with census data, with literacy. The differences which you find between rural or urban is something like 10 units, 15 units. Between caste you find something like 23 units. Between male, female you find some units. But if you take rural male SC and all that, make the total Cartesian product, you will have the least being 15 and the highest being 98 also. So, what will happen? The purpose is becoming that it is increasing the variance, good for a statistician to model, but those are not identification by themselves, this is a facilitating factor to give you the Cartesian product. So, there are intersection and dynamics of inequality. It can be adequately captured from vertical and horizontal perspective because of the fact that this horizontal perspective has dominated, because within group if you compute a vertical measure of inequality you can, provided of the number. You cannot do it for 5 people or 4 people, but you need the number. So, I come to this is what I was telling, you have a Cartesian product and does it make sense to have such grouping, and somebody will ask why and how far can you go. You had 3 attributes, why didn't you take 10? Then you will have more spread of it. So, there is no limit. So, as a researcher we have to fix a limit somewhere, which is that limit. So, in this example as you see, like you had only 3 and you had 8 groups, so you can have 80 groups if you have more attributes. So, when we say the most disadvantaged and most advantaged, this is one small facilitation this exercise does, and that facilitation is refers to fixing the extreme. What happens if certain attribute or identity is coming as a pattern of extreme, reading all of the between against the extreme becomes a good job. You know very well, and we are all used to computing odds, computing this. So, it is more important that if you give me the extremes, but otherwise if you get a reasonable extreme, of course, if you break it up, you get a reasonable extreme because of the fact that the extremes will be also distant, as I gave the example of literacy. So, when we talk about what is our interest is not merely to identify, but the process of leverage. What is leveraging over what? It is, you are talking of gender differentials or gender inequality and then leveraging with certain things. You are talking of caste, then with occupation and asset holding, land holding, whichever one you want to do is important that within that what is happening needs to be captured and stated about. This is a paper which I just now referred that we did the group analog, and in this brief talk I really want everybody to understand. Actually, some time back somebody told me that as many people in India use Gini, 90% of them do not compute Gini, and it is a fact. Why it is a fact? Because we give inequality measure anyway, you can appreciate what is the level of inequality. But more important is that why should we not understand what departure are we taking. I do not want you to engage with the entire table to understand. I just want that what is happening to the intersectional groups in terms of the total level that you have of undernourishment. If total level is smaller or bigger, how the split of 8 groups creates the distance. This table was particularly to say that when your levels are bad, does it give a more spread, or when levels are smaller, I mean better, does it give a more wider spread? That was the purpose. Why I wanted you to know this group profiling is in this table, that which I was trying to tell it in words. You see, you have a what is called your Lorentz profiling. This is called your Lorentz profiling. But if you do group profiling, what is the advantage? And that I want, very frankly, if anyone feels that I am talking mathematics, please tell me, sir, repeat it, what you mean by that. I am actually giving a very, very small example. When you compute a particular prevalence of any phenomenon, you divide it by n, am I right? What is n divided by n? Now, this n constitutes of n1, n2, n3, there are 5 groups or 6 groups of people. Sort them out from small to high. Now, you compute that prevalence. Now, you compute that prevalence. Only thing you will do is not compute prevalence independently, but compute the prevalence on cumulation, simply on cumulation. That means n1 plus n2, n1 plus n2 plus n3 is in your denominator, and you get a distribution of that. That distribution does not agree with the line that is from origin to the level. Your level is placed on the y axis, and origin to the level, when you move, it does not come on that line. That departure, why I am exposing that in here, is also important in our intersectionality discourse. In intersectionality discourse, if I am talking of 8 or 18 groups, and they have fortunately NI values reasonable enough, then I can do a group profiling where I can know what departure is happening and where is the departure more. Now, even if you are not asking, I can say what question you can ask me is that what is the logic behind this cumulation? The logic behind this cumulation is what? Why from what? If you are mixing all identities, what do you get? The thing is, when you mix an identity and move with your count, ultimately this is count, ultimate y axis value will be your 100% count. So, when you move with an additional attribute, or attribute means that characteristics group, is inequality deviating more or merging it down? So, you get an idea. Now, giving an illustrative example is, let us take 3 groups 1, 2, 3. You have overall available under nutrition level is 40%. So, you have undernourished children and you have total children. Now, group 1, when you compute, group total children is 400. The first group is 100, next group is 180, okay, and next group is 120. So, you have to do 100 and 120 and 180. 100, 100 and so you sort it with the number. Now, what you do, you compute that 40% which you have, for 100 you compute.
So, 40% of children are undernourished.
Honest. That is on your y axis, that is 40, 0.40. Now, you start computing, if it was actually uniform among all of them, you will have a dot at 40, that level you will have. Even for 100 you compute, you can get 40%. But what you do, you compute for 100, what is the percentage you see? You compute it for 220, then you go to your 400.
100 plus 120.
So, that is 220. That is what I mean by accumulation. So, when you go in this cumulative path, I told group 1, 2, 3, they can have their own identities. So, what identity did you mix now and what departure did happen? This is called, borrowed from the idea of profiling by Sorok's poverty profile. When he talks about poverty across groups, he says groups by count are important. Overall prevalence of poverty is suppose 30%, then Y you have 50% poverty. So, what will happen is, when you do cumulate and that group comes in, poverty will go up. It will not come on that line. And he says the ideal line is actually an average line which should come from 0 to there. It's a triangle. It's basically an expectation approach table. There is nothing. So, what happens is that even in the simplest computation, I am not complicating because I am not sharing this paper with you. This went through 4 revisions and I had to actually do a lot of appendix addition to that. That is not important. What I wanted to tell is that you have this cumulative itself is telling you what exactly is the departure. You are not computing here inequality. You are seeing from that line there is a departure, and then process of summarizing that departure with some weight, this, that is finally the inequality. That is not so important than knowing what ideal departure you are examining. Now, this is an intersectional view, why I say, because the range of disparities that you will see, like I gave you an example of 3, you can do with the same thing 8, you can do the same thing 12 and see what kind of departure does emerge.
This is a single attribute.
Yes, single attribute. This was the intersectional view, one approach I told. So, let me summarize, I have gone very long. The first point I told you was the engagement with the data collection, the design. The second point that I wanted to sell is basically intersectionality view, when you see on average levels changing, the variances spreading out, what kind of way you can look at intersectionality. When you have group information, you have an outcome, you have the group NIs. Let us come to now point 2, where actually why inequality indices, axiomatic properties. I didn't deal much in detail, but gave you some impression. So, it is how we define inequality normative. That is why I put this slide just after that, this which I told you group profile, is because here normative becomes what? I gave you a Sorok profile normative, that is your average is told that there is an average line from, and then that is a normative. Now, one challenge remains is that when we are engaged in intersectionality analysis, we also have to think of some normative. This which I gave you is basically a statistical normative because of the fact that it is accumulation and it conforms to something we can. But we can have our own normative as well, because normative fixing is definitely the jurisdiction of the researcher, provided you can convince why you took that as a norm. And then should groups with smaller population share be given, more weight should be given, less weight should be given. This has been in debate in inequality all the time. But it is not important to say that Ni size is important, because statistically what will happen? If Ni share, that is the group share Ni is 3%, and there is a tremendous change in the outcome happened in that group, will it reflect in the aggregate? No. It will not reflect in the aggregate. So, what happens normally who do not engage with intersectionality inequality, they always try to cover this up by showing actually broad groups, and that is where intersectionality advocates have a positive stance, because you are covering up something which needs to be enveloped out as to saying no, there is some story underneath which should come out. So, what I wanted now to engage is the third point. I started with 4 issues that I promised I will talk. So, 2 I have talked. This is the third point. Simple descriptive logistic regression decomposition analysis can be used to understand group differences. I have made it covering the Indian literature, broadly the quantitative literature, which has engaged with inequality and found out its reasons and attributes. These are the methods. Now, this in this framework kind of thing, what happens is that when I wanted to see that many people are trying to talk about this framework story to take from what are the attributes, these attributes gives rise to this, I want to see an outcome. Without engaging with this, this was just put for a referral for myself, but I want actually this kind of a thing. You have health behavior outcome like smoking, alcohol, physical inactivity in diet, nutrition, and you have physical and social environment. What happens is that when in regression analysis or something, we actually have outcomes are also interactive by themselves, and your characteristics are also interactive, because it is not necessary that just because one regression coefficient comes for, then I can stand on it and say this cannot be challenged, because that is the display of an aggregate story. But I want the what I learned as a student, the path of the causation, not really the causation per se, but the pathways of causation. If we go forward with pathways of causation, situation becomes that you have to understand these kind of theoretical concepts where norms and values, economic parts, norms and values, because if you take gender by itself and no norms and values, then that makes no sense. It is a dry fact of saying this is what it is giving, but you have to include qualitative aspects of it which will give you the pathway. Well, in statistical analysis, Duncan has done a beautiful work. I mean, nobody now uses path analysis ever, but we know path analysis actually tells us, even if it is a simpler bivariate regression story, but we know that what is the direction in which this particular association exists. Some understanding we have, but they are again limiting to the fact that because it is regression based, it is within that characteristics what is the variation that matters. Now, coming to all this whole gamut of things, if I bring in, then characteristics attributes will be sidelined, because characteristics attributes are conditioned within a context and a circumstance. Characteristics attributes are not general. I will think I had some 5,000 or optimum size survey and I found out it is true all over the world. I can't say, because context circumstances are important. And there comes the story that even intersectionality in context and circumstances could be different. Intersectionality might respond to the levels of the phenomenon. Intersectionality ultimately will also relate to the distributional sense of the composition. Composition, when I say, because the groups that you have, it will also respond according to the composition that you have. now, a little bit of engagement which is substantive literature has done, which is also important lesson to be added to intersectionality, is that when we talk of inequalities in this vocabulary, because I'm not a person I actually contribute in this, but I do read it because it is important to know that these vocabularies, income and wealth distribution, economists when they engage with inequality, there will be a very good strong smell of income and wealth. We will have literature which will have a strong smell of social exclusion, the aspect of social exclusion, because it is very easy to divide these papers, because when you read it you know that the smell comes as to what they are really focusing towards. And education, because in inequality literature in initial stages, every inequality was because of education. There was a time in 80s when every health outcome was because of maternal education, nothing else. But now nobody is talking, but that is called the seasonality in social science skewness. So we do dominate with certain ideas, and it's a fact. So when I say socio-political context you take this, I am not saying that we deny this. We have to actually have sensitivity to this, because if you are engaging with intersectionality with this sensitivity, perhaps explaining intersectionality becomes genuine, not merely quantitative, but it becomes genuine and gets supported by the contextual information. That is why I put that when you identify variable, what kind of scenarios and things you should take. Now, I will come to the multivariate analysis. In a multivariate analysis situation, when I am trying to find out determinants of inequality, which will give me clues as to what is the determinant of attribute, usually there is a big challenge about saying that I may find that inequality variation is because of these attributes, but never, of course, I even decline to title anything as the word determinant. Being a statistician, I actually am very, very uncomfortable by using the word determinant. Forget about cause. Because once you use the word determinant means you are saying it determines. Never there is any method actually which will tell you that it determines. So, the most safest word that I use, correlate. Associate correlates rather than saying determinants, and it becomes very difficult to convince somebody that it determines. So, this inequality is an outcome, it is determined by these attributes, we can't say, it is influenced by, we can say, it is associated with these attributes, we can say, but determining is difficult. And that debate still remains in the regression framework when somebody wants to compute inequality determinants, that remains. And of course, that is, and if you go back to simple principles of OLS, you can always stand up and say that where is your causation, please show me. I mean, there is no causation. You are starting with a linear, you have a correlation frame, from there only you are building up everything and say it is not a cause anyway. So, I say there other aspects which are very important, which I began with, is that your sample design weights, they matter a lot because they actually give the result. Some occasions, of course, many researchers do not engage. You take two scientifically designed samples of the same 50,000 households and do a same outcome analysis, you will find two results. That is possible because being a statistician, you become the punch bag. Whatever you give is not good, but whatever you give within the constraints, that nobody counts. And then they say, after all you did, then what? That becomes another challenge. So, obviously, when we are doing intersectionality work, it is also very difficult to convince that intersectionality, what we say is this combination of attributes does, they are not going to buy it very easily. But rather than banking on these strong concepts which we say causality is there, these are its determinants, I have used the word determinant, but therefore, that is why beforehand I told I decline actually always to use the word determinant, because there is nothing determining about it. This is something which also is a very, very popular method which has some connotation to link to understanding intersectionality. Why? Because Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition method has two components which we derive from that. It is a decomposition method. What we do is that when we have two characteristics, like suppose male, female I put as a variable in my regression, then I will get a coefficient. But If I am not doing that, I do a regression by keeping away male female variable, and I do it for male, I do it for female, I do it for total. Expectedly what will happen? Almost all the coefficients that you will have, it will have around the total. Am I right? It will be around the total, because total will have a line, for males there will be a line, but female will have a line. Now what it does is that the coefficient in the total where you ignored gender as a variable, male female as a variable, you have a difference in each of that. That gives you a dynamic that how male female operates in education, how male female operates in this particular thing. You will say that why not we do a dummy. Now dummy does not do that job. Dummy basically does a job of differentiating the means. I deviated to this idea of this because in Blinder Oaxaca, like I explained you the profiling thing, in Blinder Oaxaca also you have a story which tells, and its biggest and more important part of interpretation is in these three things which I have written. You have an endowment effect, you have a coefficient effect, and then you have a interaction effect. Let me tell you what is in a more simpler way, what is endowment effect? After all, if you Blinder Oaxaca is a regression exercise, you have attributes. But when you say education as a variable and you did not have rural urban. Now rural endowment will have its own way how education will affect your outcome. So rural is an endowment. Now in this Oaxaca decomposition of inequality, what you get actually is coefficient effect is an attribute, its coefficient, as a coefficient it will work. Why I am giving this in this intersectionality lecture is because when you have attributes 3, 4, of which you have taken SC, ST, rural with economic status, you also want to know whether the economic status by itself does how much, and economic status conditioned by attributes does how much. That is why I was telling you overall average. I mean, I have organized this talk around all that, how overall average and its distribution matters in the exercise of Oaxaca. Oaxaca decomposition, you need not even like logistic regression, do not have to read method, nothing. It is there in the startup package, click it, it will give you the output. But the question is output you can have it readily, and if you want to use the manual, interpretation also be written, but then sometimes they even write an interpretation where actually your context you can replace and rest all can remain the same. You do not have to change the English also. That is one of my students introduced me that. I told please do not do that. Because the interpretation is written in a way that this is coefficient and this is that, this is the table. And then what you do, you are running in maternal health, somebody is doing in neonatal health, just change the words. If the variables remains the same. That also we have facilitated, but that is not a, that is a damaging facilitation anyway. So Blinder Oaxaca in that perspective has a connection to intersectionality. This is, I will skip this because this is completely invisible. I made a very big mistake anyway. This is results when you read on Blinder Oaxaca, and how it relates is because strong endowment disadvantage for rural children. This is a conclusion on undernourishment Blinder Oaxaca decomposition when I do, and why it is. Maternal education is important, but in rural areas maternal education is low. So what happens? Rural endowment, maternal education will not show the impact, okay, in the Blinder Oaxaca results. Similarly, if you have income is important, but rural areas have low education. So see, income will be important by itself, but what it does is that when you are a whole range of observations you are taking, and your average level of income in rural area and urban area is very dispersed, but you have income overall you are taking, you are ignoring, but when you take rural areas, then its impact will become pretty low because of the fact that there is no variation in income in rural areas. So in a Oaxaca decomposition, when you have multiple attributes, this becomes its sensible way of getting across, coming out of that thing rather than misinterpreting. When this I finished, I say that this was the point that I made in this point 3 of my talk, is that simple decomposition can easily inform you whether endowments matter more or discrimination or difference in effects from the same level of endowment. That means here, because you are engaging with intersectionality, you must be able to finitely point on what attribute are you interested in. Suppose for instance you are trying to make intersection with caste, do it, but then you will know whether caste based endowment sometimes can pull it down. I mean, the effect could be because of the fact that it will not have it to a suppression effect in terms of which even currently I am currently working on something which is in my mind at this stage, which I must share with you, and it might impress few of the people who are interested in gender. Because people talk about gender mediation. I am talking of what is called externality. There is a big literature, celebrated literature on the fact that female education has better well-being implication. Wonderful. What I am trying to question is that female education by itself does not attain its potential externality unless it is accompanied with compatible level of male education. So basically, when you talk about externality implication, we are seeing that female education is better well-being, but my question is, has it attained its the best potential? And the case I am trying to demonstrate is that its potential is much, much better than what we have realized. This is purely because of ignoring male education level with female education, where the mediation is happening in a different way. So this was the point 3 of my talk. Now I come to the final one, that is called towards a causal analysis. Well, though I told I will avoid, but I have to say, because it is there and people claim I agree or not is not important, but they say there is a partial causal linkage between the inequality arising and the attributes therein. This is the paper of Aditi. This I put here because I am not going to blame that you have told causal, but I have just put because of the fact that it is who gains, who loses and how. You have titled, that is what impresses me more. It is not that who gains and who loses, we end there, and the process need to be told. How does this dynamic happen? Therefore, this example which I gave you about externality is a similar story, because of the fact that when we say there is an improved externality, but we do not know whether the externality is getting mediated by certain conditioning and circumstances. And for intersectionality literature, I think I quoted this work for a valid reason, because the aspect of leveraging that they talk about is very, very substantially important. It can be actually applied in other domains as well. How leveraging happens within a household, how leveraging happens within a community, because leveraging is basically not that saying that how it operates on, and it depends on, your attribute is one, but its outcome will not be straight by quantification of addition, but quantification of addition with positive conditioning. What I mean by saying positive conditioning, and I also do some work on what is called household conditioning assessment in terms of power relation. Because when you have a household conditioning which is positive, that means there is no adversity which you expect. But then thing is, conditionings are positive by my own idea is not to say that these are all positive and does not put anybody at an adverse situation. It can, but it is minimal if I say that conditioning is positive. So this story when we take further, then we know that actually who is able to leverage? Income is able to leverage more, social identity is able to leverage more, and leveraging can be on either direction. Leveraging can be in an adverse direction, can be in a positive direction. So in intersectionality literature, when you do putting the intersectional variable or the combination, you are able to reach to say that actually in this particular combination, this is the attribute which leverages over the other. Because when you have an outcome, you found that low level of education, but belonging to a particular homogeneous community. I mean, after reading your paper long back, of course, but then I was thinking, I was doing a relatively related analysis almost of saying tribal programs do well in some part of the country and do not do well. I was trying to see whether it is because of tribal concentration. if the share of tribal population is larger and share of tribal population is lower, do tribal programs, its success is related to their agency by itself. So whether this is not something to do with, you can say levels of education is better, execution is better, governance is better, well, all indicators we can get, but still a regression analysis or a kind of a distributional analysis informed me that actually when their agency is lower, performance is better. Because when their share of population is smaller, and there is something called, when we see performance analysis in government records, they do not give this variable. They will give geographically in district, this, that, these schemes we have, and this is the extent of success and all that. So what I did additionally is nothing but taking one variable called tribal share of population. And the share becomes larger, there is also scope for share being larger, the impact and demand can be different. Leverage part is also important in your intersectionality connect. And then this is primarily because what we are trying to do is that an individual's attribute and its individual's 5, 7, 8 attributes. What happens, I was just imagining, this is my imagination in this aspect which I want to share with you, that if I take 5 identities in this room, I fix 5 identities and I distribute all the 5 identities one person may not have, and I can get a distribution of these identities in this room itself. And once I get it, I talk about some perception question, for instance. Do you agree with moral policing, kind of one question. So I will say that which are these attributes which are going in favor of moral policing or not. If I do that, what will happen is there is a kind of concentration of attribute which will give rise to yes or no. Of course, this dichotomy scale is a very risky scale, but still we can place somewhere in an ordinal way also. So when you find out determinant, what happens is that this particular statement which people give on a perception or something, why should we always deal with continuous outcomes? We should also deal with dichotomous outcomes and see whether what determines which leveraging works. My feeling is that this will depend on the identity display that is going to actually be having a bearing on this outcome. Because if you ask me, that's something which I say subscription and ownership. I have an ownership of an identity, I subscribe something else. I hope you understand, because I own, I am conservative, but I am very liberal in terms of other question if you ask. So it's like subscribe to something and you own something. So in this leveraging process, what happens is that this leveraging which you do, you don't have to necessarily own always. You can also do through subscription identity. You will be identified in that group. Like you support a certain cause, you will be identified in that group. Benefits of that kind can come to you, but you may not necessarily own it. So when it comes to intersectional identities, it is not merely the observed attributes that we have at hand, but we also should deal with this complexity of subscribed identity versus owned identities when it comes to characteristics. Example for subscription, I should tell you, this is something which is in a very recent paper I read, where actually characteristics to identities to its operational outcome. Normally what happens is that when this is my demographer hat I am wearing, if you ask me when do you want your son to get married, I will say 30 years is fine. But if you ask me what is the ideal age at marriage for boys, I will say 22. This is the best example. Why? Because, and we collect survey data and analyze, no, but then this thing will not be coming out because of the fact that we have not asked that. What you want and what you want the society to be. That all ideal language, you want to be the change is fine. Nobody wants to be the change. They have their own change within themselves as like any money change, and then rest all is different. So this is the reason for which any serious engagement with leveraging should be done, because you know how it happens. Actually, I gave a kind of graph non-treatment, because if you have something which is not available to me. Suppose for instance I do not have resources, how do I behave? Okay? But that attribute will actually depend on, which again is a factor which you can perhaps, if any of you are engaged with analysis of raw data, you must know that actually it is not availability of resources that makes you decide your portfolio of expenditure. It is your valuation of return. So, the valuation of return is always not with you should have availability, and in fact, why I am giving this just to is just a provocation, of course, do not take it that I take that stance. Provocation is that upper caste people spend more on capability like health and education, lower caste people do not. It is not necessary how do I come to this conclusion, which ladder of consumption expenditure they are in relation to how much do they spend. Suppose if you look at the data, I mean I am not manufacturing it, you see that there is a kind of a mismatch. Why does that happen? Well, there are very sufficiently important reasons why it happens. So, I am not taking a stance, but the thing is this indicates that how a particular identity can twist, it can leverage through to come to that even in non-treatment. Suppose I do not have a treatment, that subsidy is not given to me, one treatment you take, and how it will show our groups, it will not show a systematic pattern, it will show a pattern very, very erratic depending on the context and circumstance. This is basically in a same thing I wanted to present of odds of borrowing sell up asset for treatment. If you take, then who borrows? I mean I am only using the results of the data that every morning evening I play with. So, this is shows that if you have health expenditure for which you borrow, it is not necessarily that you are poor and you borrow. Poor added with some other attributes, you see they will not be borrowing, okay, but they will still be poor. So, what happens is any outcome has a kind of dynamic which connects to intersectionality per se, because I understand it is a combination of attributes and to designatedly find out a pathway of that. Now, this was the key findings in that paper of Aditi, which is that there is striking similarity between middle groups, poor men and non-poor women, which was very contrast, because non-poor women and poor men, and you could find, because that means this levels of economic status is an homogeneous category, and you cannot say, because how operation is happening, how leverage happens is important. And then is called, in this paper there has been a very exemplary illustration of gender leverage, but I was thinking that there are other kinds of leveraging which can be also worked on if we do not talk of gender leverage. For instance, there is a lot of status leveraging which happens in our society, where we stay, with whom we work, what kind of identity we predominantly expose ourselves as. That has a lot of role in terms of leveraging. So, leveraging can be, this particular work can be extended onto other domains as well. Now, this was my point 4, that a causal analysis is possible if it is guided by sound and theoretical insights of framework. Regression analysis without theoretical basis will remain at a descriptive level only. You can only say, but you cannot take it any further forward. So, let me summarize that these 4 points, how convincingly I put through, it will say after I leave, but the conclusion of today's talk that I wanted to share with is that view through the intersectionality lens opens up the entire discourse on equity per se and calls for nuanced understanding of causal pathways. Causal pathways, which till date was believed in, is not, it has actually opened a newer window to look at. The example shown here using the intersectional lens has perhaps emerged with several questions which are often obscured and of conventional view from the conventional one. Why gender has a major influence among poor, why female continue to be deprived in high income settings are some concerns that have emerged only because of an intersectional perspective. Not only emerged, that has been recognized rather now that we are saying violence happens in higher economic strata of the society. Why does it happen? Now, one clear motivation to apply intersectionality is that it can help identify questions and concerns that were relatively unknown or unexpected in the past. But the challenge is to connect the intersectional groups from an instrumental and policy perspective. I am not sure, there is a lot of more work required to justify this ground. It has also opened up the entire field of analyzing middle group. This is another domain, that what is that middle group? What are kind of attribute you take to define that middle? And which hitherto has remained a neglected aspect in research on health inequalities. Thank you very much.